Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of CRDCN to the ninth webinar in our series with the Journal of Canadian Public Policy. I will start by acknowledging that McMaster University, the host institution for CRDCN, is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. We begin this session by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations and to recognize our responsibility as guests to respect and honor the intimate relationship Indigenous peoples have to this land. We are going to use the Q&A function today for asking questions. So if you have any questions, please use that function and we'll ask the presenter directly following their presentation. To begin, Dr. Tammy Sherrill, CPP editor, will welcome our speakers.
Hi, thanks, Tess, and thanks to everyone for coming, and thanks to CRDCN for continuing to collaborate with CPP in this webinar series. It's nice to be able to bring in so many people from different places all at once to this webinar. I'm, of course, joining you from Waterloo, Ontario, which is also the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. It's great for you to be here today. Before I introduce our speakers, I'm going to give myself just a moment to say hello and take this opportunity to thank everyone that has helped me transition into this role as the new editor at CPP. It's certainly been a few busy months as I learned the job, and there's been many transitions along the way. But I did want to thank, of course, Mike Veal, who was central to the journal's success over the past decade. And it was certainly his work that went into getting this September 2025 issue together, which includes both of the papers that we are seeing today being presented. I also wanted to mention that there's another special issue out there this November. It was on sustainable finance and climate change. And we have another coming in the new year with artificial intelligence and public policy. So CPP has been very, very busy this year. I'm very happy that both of our speakers could visit with us today and present some of the papers from that September issue. So at this point, it's really best to turn it to our speakers. Today, we have Ross Hickey, who is joining us from UBC Okanagan in Kelowna, BC, and he'll be telling us about his paper, Tax Reported Charitable Giving in Canada, 1987 to 2018. Ross, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, thanks, Tammy. Just give me a moment here. Okay, I think we can all see my slides now. So yeah, this paper is not a work in progress. It's a published paper that you can find in the September issue of Canadian Public Policy, and the title of the paper is Tax Reported Charitable Giving in Canada, 1987 to 2018. And this is joint work that I've done with two excellent co-authors, Abigail Payne and Justin Smith. And the work has been supported by, of course, our universities, as well as a research institute from Australia, the Australia National University Tax and Transfer Policy Institute, and a Canadian organization called FELAB. It's also supportive of our research. Of course, I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the Canada Research Data Center Network, without whom we would not be able to do this kind of work. This is the kind of work that I'm excited about doing, getting access to very high quality data in a secure manner that enables us to maintain the confidentiality and the integrity of the data for all people who are Canadians and who are represented in our samples. So I just really appreciate the CRDCN, and glad that Canadian Public Policy and CRDCN are doing these kinds of joint endeavors to help us share the research that we do, because there's many hours that many of us who are working with the CRDCN do in typically, very isolated environments, trying to shed light on important issues for Canadians. So it's nice that we're doing this, bringing some of this data to light. Okay, so what we do in our paper is we try to add to the literature that is trying to capture what's going on in charitable giving in Canada. Okay, charitable giving is a big part of the revenues that, I mean, when I say charitable giving, I mean tax receipted donations are a big part of the revenue that Canadian charities rely upon. Okay, and it's important to understand what some of the trends are, because if we think about the most recent shock, negative shock that we've seen in Canada being COVID-19, charities were dramatically affected as a result of the decrease in incomes that Canadians felt. And so we started working on this paper during the pandemic, and really we thought that this is a great chance. We're looking at data before the pandemic to try to see what kinds of trends were in place before the pandemic arose, to learn about what the resiliency is of the individual donor tax base for Canadian charities. And so in this paper we examine long run estimates of giving using the LAD, which is a great data product that you can access through the CRDCN. And what the LAD does is that allows our long-term analysis to provide something different than existing long-term analyses of Canadian giving, is that we can look at the household as a unit of analysis. Typically, studies that have looked at long-run trends in giving in Canada use aggregates that are constructed through Statistics Canada, and those aggregates are based on individual files. However, individuals often give within a household. The the tax credit available to charitable contributions is transferable within a household, and so really the household is the appropriate unit of analysis for thinking about giving. And so we're able to look at households over time, and that allows us to also, with the rich data from the lab, we can see where people are living, which provinces they're in. We can look across the income distribution, and we can also look across the age distribution to see whether differences in provinces, differences in incomes, and differences in age have impacts on donations. In this paper, we focus on trends. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to walk through a series of figures that are in the paper. Of course, I leave some of the most interesting parts of the paper for people to go and read and learn about themselves. So this is almost all of the highlights, but not all of them. So I do encourage people to take a look at the paper. But we're going to focus today's talk on the trends. And so most of all of the dollar figures that I'm including in this presentation are in 2018 dollars. Okay, our data is from 1987 to 2018, and we're looking at all in 2018 dollars. And the big picture is what I want to try to highlight here. What are some of those trends? Particularly, we're going to look at the intensive margin and extensive margin. So the extensive margin is whether people claim donations or not, and that's our indication of whether people are giving. Okay. And part of the reason why I'm gonna go back and forth between saying giving and claiming donations. We try to discuss those two being equivalent in the paper. Of course, some people don't claim the donations that they make, but every Canadian can benefit from the charitable donations tax credit because it's not based upon your income. It's a non-refundable tax credit, so it's of no value to you in a year in which you have no taxable income. But if you don't have any taxable income in one year, you may within 5 years, and it's transferable across years. It's also transferable across spouses, and it's quite generous. Okay, at the top end in at the federal level, it's the high tax credit rate is the highest marginal income tax rate, and that applies to all donations over $200. So we know that not everyone who makes a donation is claiming them, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'll go back. I will use the word giving when referring to tax receipted donations. So that's the extensive margin, whether people give or not. And the intensive margin then is how much do people give? Okay, so we're going to focus on the means here as well as a measure of the intensity of giving. Okay, so with that, let's look at some pictures. Um, right here, what we see is a kind of spaghetti plot, if you will, of giving the mean charitable donations from 1987 to 2018, broken down by province. Okay, and these are in 2018 dollars. And what we can see here, I just want to kind of highlight one particular year in the diagram. I really should have highlighted this with something indicating visually. But if we just look at 1995 as a year, all provinces, we see differences in the levels of mean charitable donations across provinces, but the trends are very similar, okay, prior to 1995. And then once we look past 1995, we start to see some divergence there, where we see the Western provinces in particular, and Ontario, starting to have increasing mean donations. And then the mean donations seem to be much more volatile for those Western provinces in Ontario as we go into the 2000s. And meanwhile, the Atlantic provinces in Quebec, we see donations don't change as much and don't exhibit as much volatility. Okay. So I highlight the year 1995 because that's the year in which the government of Canada at the federal level um, expanded the exemption for donations of capital property. Okay, so but prior to 1995, the opportunity for you to reduce your tax burden by making a donation of capital property was much less than in 1995. 1995 onwards, tax re real and financial property that's donated to eligible charitable institutions is exempt from the capital gains that would have been taxed on that asset. So what we see is much more encouragement of giving of these capital properties after 1995, and that can partly explain part of the divergence that we're seeing. Those provinces that have higher incomes on average we see higher mean donations after 1995, whereas before we don't see so much of a difference. So that's one thing to keep in mind as we proceed through. We're going to see the year 1995 as a kind of watermark year in charitable giving. Of course, there are other changes that took place in that year. There was the the tax credit rate structure in Canada is such that at present donations that are in total above $200 are eligible for the high tax credit rate. A total of donations below $200 is eligible for the low tax credit rate. Um, Prior to 1995, that kink in the tax credit rate schedule was at $250. It was lowered to $200 in 1995. But that tax price change doesn't seem to be as impactful for total donations as the change in the treatment of capital gains when people donate real property. So that's the first thing to take a look at. That's kind of a good news story that we're seeing. We expanded the eligibility of capital assets to be donated to charities, and we see more of that. Means have increased. But the negative side of what we're seeing with charitable giving in Canada is that there's a downward trend in the share of all Canadian tax filers that report a donation in a particular year. And if we look at the peak in the beginning year of our data, 1987, we see that take a look at Prince Edward Island, the highest province in the rank order of these lines here. We see that it's reduced in scope from 50%, or just about 50% of all tax filers claiming donations in 1987, down to what looks like about 35% in 2018. So that's a pretty dramatic reduction. And other provinces follow a similar trend. And so this is one thing that the literature and Canadian policymakers have been focused on over the last couple of decades is that there's a decrease in the frequency with which Canadians are claiming charitable donations. And so we've introduced, you could look through the history of tax treatment of charitable contributions and see that there's been a host of different measures that have been introduced, and none have really seemed to make a big impact. Okay. But again, this is just something for us to contextualize our understanding of the charitable sector. Okay. So what's happening though in Canada is that while we see the share of donors decreasing, the share of tax filers donating decreasing, we do see that the mean has increased, and that increase in the mean seems to be coming much more from the top 10% of income earners than from other parts of the income distribution. So here, again, a spaghetti plot where we're looking at income deciles of the Canadian tax filer population. And what we see here is that for all deciles below the top 10%, that is for the deciles 1 to 9, okay, number 10 being the top 10% of income earners, it's relatively flat. Mean charitable donations is relatively flat throughout our sample period. But when we look at the top 10%, in that year of 1995, we see that donations start to increase, and we see there's, again, much more volatility associated with donors from that decile of the income distribution. Okay. Another way of thinking about this is to look at a Lorenz curve of giving. Okay, and here what we're looking at is the, if you will, again, I should have put a 45-degree line in here to help us, but if you imagine a 45-degree line going from 0, 0, the origin, up to 100, 100, the gap between the space between the curve, this Lorenz curve that's plotted, and that 45-degree line would indicate the measure of the inequality of giving. Okay, and what we see here is that that gap, that space has been increasing. In the year 1990, the Lorenz curve was closest to the 45-degree line. And the year 2018, the Lorenz curve is furthest from where that 45-degree line would be, showing us that there's been an increase in the concentration of giving amongst the the larger donors from the higher income quintiles here. So we go a little bit further to say, well, let's look at an even smaller fraction of tax filers at even higher income levels. And so now we're going to look at the uh, top 0.1% of income earners. And again, when we break down the income quantiles, here we're showing the 90th, 95th, 99th, and the 99.9. And again, look at that year 1995, where we see the departure. So for the top 5% and top 1%, if we would exclude the 0.1%, there's not been much change in their claiming of charitable donations. However, for the 0.1% of tax filers um, in our sample, we see that they start to give a lot more. Mean charitable donations are increasing after 1995, and again, we see much more volatility, that which we would expect to see associated with the business cycle. Okay, so um, and also we can see that the share of donors has decreased for the top 10%, top 5%, but when we get to the top 0.1%, it seems relatively flat. So the share of tax filers who are donating has been decreasing in Canada, except for at the very top of the income distribution, the top 0.1%, it seems to be relatively constant. And that's where an increasing share of donations are coming from. Okay. What we also do in the paper, again, there's lots of interesting things in the paper, but since we can, we decide we're going to look at the age profiles of individuals and see how people donate across the life cycle. Okay. Now we don't have complete life cycles for all the individual tax filers. We're looking from 1987 to 2018. So we get a nice window of time where we can see individuals. But if you look at this graph that shows again the time series of mean donations for different age cohorts, each of these little lines that are all connecting together, each segment corresponds to a different birth cohort. Okay, so again, it's really worth taking a look at the paper so you can really dig into this graph. But overall, what we can see is that there's a reasonably similar trajectory across these different birth cohorts, where giving tends to increase as people age, and then at some point flatten off. Okay, so we see that mean donations are increasing in age until we get to around age 45, at which point they seem to level off. Okay, we also then take a look at the age profile of the share of people who are donating. This is the extensive margin now of whether people claim donations or not. And here's where we see some divergence across these different birth cohorts. Okay, now those who are in our earliest birth cohort, born in 1930, we don't see them in our data for very much. They're up in the top right-hand corner of your screen. Okay, we only see them when they're approaching age 65, and 65 was our cutoff year that we used for our sample selection. So we have few years of those individuals. However, people who were born in 1965, for example, we have quite a long history of their participation in the data set. And what we can see is this uh, propensity to donate is increasing in age, but then levels off again and starts to decline as people age. All right, so what we notice in this part of our paper, we discuss how the peak in the share who are donating has arrived at an earlier age as we move from older to younger cohorts. Okay, so this is something that we might want to discuss in terms of what kinds of policy interventions we may want to consider. Who do we want to target? On the one hand, may want to target the intensive margin of those who are most likely to give and give the most. On the other hand, we may want to have more participation of those who, on the margin, we may be able to influence. Okay. The last part of the paper that I'll highlight is our look at the patterns of giving within an individual. Okay. And so here, what we wanted to see is, do people claim donations in every year? Or are people perhaps pooling their donations for a couple of years and then applying their donations all in one tax year? Remember, I said that there's a kink in the tax credit rate schedule at $200. So the low credit rate at the federal level applies for donations in total under $200, and the higher credit rate applies for donations that exceed $200, okay, in aggregate. And so because you can transfer donations across tax years for up to 5 years, there's an incentive for those who give less than $200 to not claim their lower than $200 donations in every year and instead pool those donations until they're above the kink in the tax credit rate schedule and give in a year where you can get access to that higher tax credit rate. So that was one of the rationales for wanting to take a look at the pattern of giving. And what we see here, this diagram, again, there's more explanation of this in the text, but this is the share who donate in any one year. When we look at in our sample, we exclude people who cannot fit into this particular sample frame. The sample frame being that we need to observe you in each year for 10 consecutive years. So we break our data into a couple of 10-year windows and within those 10-year windows, we only include those individuals or households for whom we observe them in every year. And with that, we see that there's, I think, it's 40% of our tax filers claim a donation in the first year in which they are observing the data. It goes up to 70% at the other end. We can see in the year 10, who are claiming in at least 1 year within our 10-year window. Okay, so the 40% who are claiming in the first year, those are of the 70% that claim in any year within the 10 years, that 40% represents those who claim in all years. Okay, so of those 70% of tax filers who claim a donation ever in a 10-year window, 40% of the 70%, which is 57%, that's the majority, 57% are claiming in each year. Okay, so again, it's a kind of tricky thing to follow, but if you look at the paper, it's explained much better than I did just now. So I would encourage you all to take a look at the paper. Okay, similarly, we look at this across the income distribution. Okay, so now we're looking at quartiles because we want to make the figure kind of easy to read. And there you see, again, the incidence in which one claims a donation is increasing in their income. Okay, so if we look at these quartiles, the darker shade is if you're in the bottom 25% of income tax filers based on your income, and the lightest shade is if you're in the top 25%. We see that the share who are donating within the highest quartile, the top 25%, is much higher than in the bottom quartile, the bottom 25%. Okay, and we see as you move through through time, we see that, of course, like the previous graph displayed, there's an increase in people giving in at least 1 year of our 10-year window. But of course, it's much higher for those who are higher income than for those who are lower income. Okay, and here again, we look at how many times in this 10-year window do we see someone claim a contribution? And now we've included another number here, 0, right? So the modal number of times someone claims a donation in the tax data is 0, right? Just close to 27% of tax filers in the 10-year window don't claim any donations. Okay. The next most frequent number of times someone has donated, though, is 10 years in that 10-year window, right? So there's the people who never give, and then the next highest incidence is the people who always give. They're claiming donations in every year, and that's about 17% here. Okay, and as you look throughout the number of times donated distribution, you see that there's a little bit of a U shape there. So this is again thinking about policy. We want to think about this as something that highlights the importance of the extensive margin of whether people give or not. Acti Interventions or policies that can help encourage those who never give to give seem like they may bear fruit. However, of course, there was the first time donor tax credit that was introduced about, I don't know, 8 years ago, and it didn't seem to have much of an impact. But of course, there were maybe ways to expand upon programs such as that to try to get individuals to claim donations who previously have not. Okay, so just to kind of recap what we've seen, um, giving in Canada is changing. It's more giving is more concentrated amongst the highest income earners in Canada. It's composed seemingly much more of assets, capital property. Um, and as a result, it's more sensitive to the business cycle. I say seemingly because while I highlighted 1995 as the year, unfortunately, the data does not allow us to see whether someone has given cash or capital. So we are unable to say that definitively it is that is the change that has happened. But that tax year represents the point of departure in those figures that we've shown. So giving has changed in Canada. We have this inverse profile of giving over the life cycle. So people give more as they age until they hit a point where their giving tends to plateau. But we see a shifting down in the incidence of giving over time, and that year of the peak in which an age cohort has the highest share giving has been decreasing over time. And there are more never givers in Canada than there are always givers. And so charities ought to consider both the intensive and extensive margins of fundraising. I think that's the primary policy recommendation is that hopefully with this paper, if practitioners and fundraisers take a look, they'll see that there is perhaps some opportunity to increase revenues by targeting particular fundraising strategies towards increasing the number of Canadians who are claiming donations. That is getting more to start giving and giving more. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you, Ross. This is very interesting. I'm going to remind everyone that we do have that Q&A open. If you wanted to leave a question there, that'd be great. And we have one right away. That's great. So Wayne is asking, has lower church attendance led to less giving under the assumption that regular church attendees give to their church, synagogue or temple? Can you adjust for giving done to religious organizations versus others? I know that's a challenge you have.
Yeah, sorry, I muted myself there. Yeah, so that's a great question. Um, I think you guys can still see my slides if I'm squiggling back here. Excellent. I just want to highlight something. There's a paper by Zhao and Devlin, I think maybe 2018 in the Canadian Journal of Nonprofit and Volunteering. I can't remember exactly the name of the journal, but Roseanne Devlin and a co-author have a paper that looks at religiosity and giving. From that paper, what we learn is um, that giving is a much lower incidence in Quebec, and Quebec also happens to be the most secular or least religious province within Canada. And so, if we look at the share donating here, I just went back to this cross-province graph here, and we can see that Quebec is at the bottom for the share of people claiming donations. And that's not definitive evidence of the impact of religiosity. But we also know during this time period, um, you know, sec people have become more secular. Religious participation has been declining over this time period, and we see a downward trend during this time period across all provinces. So I think that the reduction in religious participation is likely a partial explanation for what's going on with the data here. I think another thing I would say though is that If you look at, well, if we look here at mean charitable donations, um, we do see that the donations are coming much more from high income earners, and charities are likely responding. So, some charities are going to have a investment account that will be able to receive a capital asset, okay? And some charities will not. And so that's part of what's happening here as well, I believe, is that there is some charities are targeting higher income individuals who are donating capital property, and some charities are not. And I'm not sure that religious organizations have changed their fundraising strategies as much in response to the change in 1995. So who knows? But it is a nice observation, and it would be nice to see more work that could try to pull this apart. Unfortunately, our data, while it's great and rich, it does not allow us to identify different charitable organizations. It's just a total amount of donations that an individual has claimed.
Maybe if we could have just one more very quick question. I'm kind of mindful of time and we don't want to cut into the next presentation too much. Grant is pointing out that often people have very small or these roundup type donations when you're, scanning a QR code and going through quickly. And I also wondered in thinking about how you're claiming every year instead of collecting them up over for a few years, there's an administrative burden to that as well, and having to keep and hold on to all of those receipts. So a lot of people aren't claiming. Do you think that giving really means the same thing over this entire period of time in that context?
That's a great question, and a good observation. So it would be ideal for us in our interpretation of the results if there was nothing else that's changed over time and people's likelihood to claim a donation. It's true that there is a cost of record keeping. There's a nice researcher who's done some work on this at UC Santa Barbara, Joseph Benzarti, who looked at the costliness of tax filing. And there is a record keeping cost there to optimally claim the credits. You'd have to do a good job of that. I have to say it myself, I'm guilty of not claiming charitable donations, even though I study it, because you have to remember all those donations and keep track of the receipts. So that's an issue. The other thing I would say is that throughout the sample period, in one year that I didn't highlight, I highlighted 1995. Another year to highlight, though, would be the year 2011. 2011 is when the online platform GoFundMe first was introduced in Canada, and a lot of individuals will make donations online through an app like that. And so, when we think about those apps, the question is now if a organization lists itself, a charitable organization lists itself and fundraises through an online website or app, that's an eligible donation to claim the tax credit if it's listed given the same name as appears on their CRA registration. If the organization lists itself exactly the same way, then you can use that as a tax receipt and claim it. However, how many people know that? I don't know. So it's and all at the same time, given the opportunities for people to give to a sick friend or friend of a friend or family member through these kind of online fundraising platforms, that's not tax receipted charitable giving, but it is very generous displays of human kindness, right? So, and those are not measured here. So, this is not to say in our research that people are becoming less generous, I would say, over time. However, what we do know is those who claim donations give the most. Okay, and if you look at the Canadian Survey of Giving and Volunteering, where it asks people about their giving, their intentions to claim the tax credit, or not, and what kinds of organizations they give to, it's clear that those who avail themselves of the tax credits are the ones who give the most to charities. So we do want to encourage people to avail themselves of this opportunity to reduce the price of giving because that's what leads to more generosity. But I do take that on. It's important to recognize that this is not saying Canadians are becoming less generous. It's just that it's becoming harder for us to find the evidence.
I think that thought opens up a whole new line of questioning and some research to do. But there, I think, is where we'll thank you, Ross, for your presentation. It's very interesting work and a lot more in behind there to think about. Guy, I'll invite you to share your slides as I introduce you here. Guy Lacroix is joining us for the next presentation. He is coming from Quebec today, I believe. Laval University in Serrano is his affiliations. He is going to be talking to us about tax incentives and older workers. And Guy, I'll let you take the floor. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation. Do you see my slides or do you see my slides? Okay, thanks. And as I move the mouse over this, do you see this? Okay, thanks. Well, thanks for the invitation. This is a joint work with my colleague Pierre-Carl Michaud from HEC Montréal. And the motivation for this paper goes back to a paper that was published in the CPP a while back ago. And according to the authors, the tax credit I'll be studying today actually created over 28,000 jobs. And both, apparently, Pierre-Carl and myself were pretty skeptical about that, such a huge impact of such a small credit. So both he and I actually started working on this independently of one another. We didn't know, what the other was doing. And one day we end up talking about this, and we realized that we both have a paper on this, and we use similar data but entirely different estimation methods, and we get the exact same results. So we decided to make one paper instead of two competing papers, and so this is what I'll be presenting today: the impact of the Quebec's Credit for Career Extension program. So. Let me just mention a few words about this program. This tax credit was introduced in 2012. It's non-refundable, and its goal originally was to encourage workers 65 and over to remain employed. I say originally because, well, next bullet, I mentioned that the credit was enhanced and extended several times in 2005, 16, 17, and 19. And each time it was made more generous and made younger workers eligible. And finally, in this fiscal year 2025, the Minister of Finance decided to go back. It was back to the future. The program is now the same as it was in 2012. It's limited to workers 65 and over. And Pierre-Carl told me, I was on holidays then, but Pierre-Carl told me that the Minister of Finance actually mentioned our paper and the National Assembly to motivate his decision. Actually, our recommendation was to slash the whole credit. But for political reason, I guess, these workers 65 and over still can claim the tax credit. What that means is that 200,000 workers lost their eligibility this current year. And so, well, I guess there's some policy relevance to study this tax credit. So that's what we do in the paper. We investigate the efficiency of the tax credit, and we measure its net tax liability. And there's another reason why it might be relevant to do this, because back in 2021, Prime Minister Trudeau, in his mandate letter to the then Minister of Finance, she was assigned the objective to address labor shortages and help business grow by introducing a career extension tax credit of up to $1,650 per year for seniors. Well, that's exactly what we have in Quebec. So the credit was $1,650 per year, my maximum tax credit. For seniors working full-time. So these are the parameters of the tax credit. And as you can see, originally in 2012, only workers of age 65 and over could claim a maximum tax credit of $451. And that remained constant up until 2015, when the tax credit was made marginally more generous. And whoops, sorry about that. And eventually, you can see that for workers 65 and over, the tax rate amounted to a maximum of $1,650 as of 2018. But at the same time, as of fiscal year 2016, workers 64 and over could claim the credit. Then in 2017, workers 63 and over could do it, and so on and so forth. So as of last year, workers 60 and over could claim that credit. But as there was another parameter in the system. It was what we call it was clawed back, essentially. There was a reduction threshold as of 2016. So on one side, they make the credit more generous, but at the same time, it's clawed back above a certain level of income. So this is very interesting, because that's how we're going to estimate we're going to use this to measure the causal impact of the tax credit on behavior. And so those two slides essentially show you how we can use these parameters to estimate the impact of the tax credit. If you take, for example, a worker who's 65 and over for a given income, well, a tax credit will increase through time, right? On the other hand, if you take for a given year workers who earn different levels of income, well, when it's in 2012, 14, and 2015, it's flat. But as of 2016, it's clawed back. So the amount of tax credit that you can claim depends on your income, but it also depends on the year in which you claim it. So this is for the 65 and over. This is for the workers 64 and over. And so it's a different schedule, but essentially it's the same principle. So we can control for age, we can control for income, and through those variation across time and across income, we can actually identify what the impact of the tax rate might be on work and on income. There's another way we can do this. This is Pierre-Carl. Pierre-Carl, essentially, that's what he does. He exploits this feature of the parameters. What I do is a bit different. What I do is use what we call a so-called staggered implementation of the tax credit. And I look at workers who are anywhere between 55 and 61 in year 2008. And I follow every year their behavior, whether they work or not, and what their income level is. And those workers are my control group. And as of 2012, workers who were 61 or over in 2008 can claim the credit, and they can claim it forever. Workers who were 60 years of age in 2008 have to wait until 2013 to claim the credit. So the staggered implementation is such that I can use these workers here that can't claim the tax credit as a counterfactual for workers who just marginally made it past the threshold. So every dotted line is a counterfactual for workers above who have a continuous line. And of course, this is Canada, so we need a counterfactual. We might use another counterfactual, which might be Ontario, because in Ontario, the tax rate was not implemented. It turns out that both he and I found that we can't use Ontario as a counterfactual because parallel trends don't match. And so we need to avoid this. So we both use estimation strategies that doesn't use Ontario as a counterfactual. Okay. Okay, so here are the program outlays and caseloads of the tax credit. So what you see in the red line is the how much tax credit was foregone by the government through this tax credit. And it started off pretty small in 2012 at $43 million, but as time went by, the tax expenditures increased up to $363 million in the year 2019. So there's a stock and flow effect here because those who claim in 2012 can claim every following year and so on and so forth. So the number of claimants started out at 107,000 and reached a number of 350,000 in year 2019. So this is the period we will be studying, both he and I. And so the total outlay is $1 billion, more or less. Okay, that's what it costs the government to subsidize senior workers to remain on work or to come back to work. Okay. So this is a CRDCN workshop. So we'll be using a lot of data. We start with public use data from the labor force, which is the same data that was used in the previous CPP paper. Then we use the extended version of the labor supply survey in the CRDCN. And then we use two different administrative data sets. One is the LISA data set, which I use, and there's a LAD. So Professor Hickey just mentioned what the LAD was all about, so I won't go through this. But Pierre-Carl will focus on the 60, 64 workers. I look at workers who are 55 and over in 2008 and following them through all the way up until 2019. Pierre-Carl focuses, well, mind you, I say Pierre-Carl, we both work on the same one. And once we decided to merge the paper, we actually change a few things. Okay, so this is what we do in the paper. So let me show you prima facie evidence. This is the participation rate or labor force participation of workers in Quebec in blue. Those are workers who are 55 to 59 at all year. So they're never eligible for the tax credit. And what you see is that those workers as of 2005, had a lower participation rate than those in Ontario, but they kept catching up all the way, and they're never eligible for the tax credit. Workers 60-64, you see that their participation rate increases steadily before the introduction of the tax credit, and there's little gap between Quebec and Ontario, but this is the time period that we study, and the difference between the two is almost zero. Same thing for workers 65, 69, and so on and so forth. I could show you women, it's the exact same thing. Okay, so there was some catching up by workers in Quebec towards a level observed in Ontario without the tax credit being implemented. So what we do next is use the confidential LFS data and run a bunch of regressions. And this is not using the public use. This is confidential data in the RDCs. So what we find is that if you run a simple difference regression, we find that for workers 65, 69 and workers 60, 64, generally speaking, the employment rate of Quebec workers is lower than that of Ontario. Past 2012, nothing stands out in either provinces. And when we cross Quebec dummy with post tax credit, we don't find anything. Okay. In other words, perhaps for the 70 and plus, but it's negative. Okay. But for workers who were the object of the tax credit, we don't find anything. So this is perhaps contrary to using the public use data. We didn't use it, but using the public use data, LFS data, they did find an impact with this interaction variable. We don't find any, okay? Because we have the exact age, whereas in the public use, you only have intervals for age. Most importantly, we reject the parallel trends assumption for both these groups, and marginally, we accept it marginally for this group. So there's no evidence that we can use Ontario, and on my side, using my own estimator, I did reject the parallel trend assumption. Not the same test, but I do reject parallel trends. So both he and I reject the parallel trends assumption. So both he and I, independently of one another, we did not use Ontario as a counterfactual. Okay. So this is my estimation. This is the staggered assumption, the staggered estimate, and using what we call the treated versus not yet treated. So if I may go back to my slide, what I'm doing here is I'm looking at the impact of being treated in 2012 relative to everybody else. Then I look at the impact of being treated in 2013. These two groups are treated. These groups are not treated. So they are my counterfactual. Okay, but Ontario is never in my estimation strategy. So doing this, what I find is this: the impact on work is zero everywhere. Oops, I have a problem with my mouse. Okay, it's zero everywhere. And mind you, the program became more generous in 2018 and 19. I do find a small positive impact on income. But if we split the data between women and men, we find that it's essentially women who actually gained. They had a small increase in their income, which might be attributable to the tax credit. For men, we don't find anything. Okay, so it's mostly women who actually increase their income following the introduction of the more generous tax credit in 2018-19. Okay, so essentially, when I showed that to Pierre-Carl, he said, "Well, I have the same results." Okay. So what Pierre-Carl does is what we call an intent to treat. We don't know who exactly claimed the credit, but we know which population was entitled to the credit. So what we do is we exploit the fact that the generosity of the tax rate varies across years and across earnings, as I showed you previously. We focus only on Quebec workers between the ages of 60 and 64, and we compute what we call a potential tax credit, which is based on income for workers between the ages of 50 and 59. My strategy is to follow workers 55 and over. He focuses on workers 50, 59. I mean, our two papers are almost identical. Okay. So he looks at the average income and tax returns of every worker when they were between the ages of 50 and 59, and he computes for each given year what would be the tax rate they would be entitled to were they claiming it? Okay, based on their history of income and tax credit. So that's what we call a simulated tax credit. And there's some evidence in the paper which we show that the StatCan actually did impute tax return for Quebecers because it's not in the data, but they did impute it. So if we regress our simulated tax credit with that which is reported with StatCan, it's almost identical. So our simulated tax credit for those who actually potentially claimed it in Quebec, it's a pretty good fit. Okay. So next, what we do, well, we simply run a regression and we use some time varying variables like age, year of birth, unemployment rate. And most importantly, we look at the impact of the simulated tax credit on either the income or the labor supply of worker I at time T. We also control for, but that's not important. Okay, that's econometric details. Right, so here's the result. If we look at the impact of the simulated credit, that Pierre-Carl finds 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, same as me. Okay. Now, if we look at the potential impact of the credit on predicted employment, we find next to 0 employment where was generated by that tax credit. Okay. Next, we look at the reduced form estimate of the simulated tax rate on earnings because I did find something for women, while Pierre-Carl finds Pierre-Carl finds the exact same thing. So the impact of the tax credit, increasing the tax credit by $1,000 increases earnings by almost 2,000, but it's essentially women who actually gain from this, okay, which is what I found, and men with 0 for men. So in terms of net tax liability, you might increase income, but how much did you foregone in terms of tax earnings from the government's point of view? So what we find again is that it might have a positive impact on earnings, but has a negative impact on net tax liability. So it does cost something. It is a transfer from some workers to other workers. It doesn't pay itself. Okay. And this is, we use huge samples to do this. So in other words, he finds almost the same parameter estimate as I have using an entirely different estimation strategy. So to conclude, here's a figure of the employment rates for workers 60-64 using detailed labor force survey from 2017 to 2024. And as you can see, the employment rates for all workers, men and women, is always lower in Quebec, but you can see that it's catching up towards the years 2023, 2024. It's almost the same as in all other provinces. And what we claim in the paper is that this catching up has nothing to do with has very little to do with the tax credit. Okay. So we didn't make any recommendation. All we said is, well, we don't believe this was catching up as to anything to do with the tax credit. So it was abolished in 2025, except for workers 65 and over, which are not in the graph. But if they were, you'd see the exact same thing. So they're catching up, and so they get a tax credit, but they don't really need it. Okay. So that's my conclusion. So I'll be happy to take any questions if there are any.
I love a conclusion like that, Guy. Thank you very much. This is very interesting. Again, you can leave questions there in the Q&A, and since I don't see one right away, perhaps I'll take privilege here in asking. One of the things that strikes me about this type of tax credit and trying to measure out what kind of behavioral effects you might see is that for the group for which this might be salient or actually matter for their budget, you can imagine there's a group there that has some capacity to work, and then some whose health simply prevents them from working. And I'm wondering if maybe you tried, I know how difficult this can be, to try and tease out some indicators of health that you can find in these various data sets, or maybe there's another option with the CCHS.
Perhaps, but what I can say though, which is not in the paper, but we did. Well, Pierre-Carl couldn't. Well, yeah, he did it. We look at the education level, and look at the impact of the tax credit per income. In other words, we slice the data according to earnings, and we do find some impact for low earnings. So those who have low earnings actually, well, there's a small and positive impact on unemployment. It's the same for men and women. In terms of health, well, what I could answer to this is that since we have dynamic panel data, you could think that those who become entitled in 1 year, you compare them to those who are only 1 year younger.
Mhm.
So if there's any proportion of workers in those samples who can't work, they might be the same in both groups. So I don't see any reason why you would have workers who have some constraints in 1 year, and the counterfactual does not have that. So it's only 1 year apart. So you're looking at 60, 64, 65, 66. Of course, as you get older, well, I'm up there, you know. So so I mean, but because we're always comparing relative to those who are 1 year younger, the incidence of those constraints might not be that great. But again, yeah, if we could have that, mind you, in the LISA data, perhaps we do have information on this. But the problem with LISA data is that the sample is not that great. So once you start slicing the data, you do lose statistical power. This is something that would be better done with the lab data, but there's no such information in the lab. So that's why I use as LISA data, so I could cut the data. But once you start cutting the data by men, women, low education, high education, then you end up with small sample sizes, and you lose a lot of statistical power. So there's a trade-off between precision and, but I agree.
Absolutely. It's been one of my own struggles trying to connect health and retirement in, these types of these types of studies. We do have one question here in the Q&A about what can explain the difference between men and women. Are differences in pension a possible factor?
Could be, but we know from labor supply literature that men are always less responsive than women to tax credit, to earnings. What could explain this? Mind you, the employment rate of women is lower than that of men. So it could be that the credit, again, if women earn less than men on average, then again, I did find that lower income are more receptive to this kind of tax credit. So it could be a mix of the fact that fewer women work on average at these ages, and those who do work perhaps have lower income than men. So this type of tax credit might be a greater incentive. There's probably not much clawback for that population. Those who earn lower income are not clawed back. So it could be that the proportion of women who are not clawed back is a bit larger than that of men. That could be an explanation. So in other words, they do get a greater tax credit than men do
Okay, thank you.
on average. Okay.
That's great. So I believe we're getting very close to time. I wasn't sure if Tess wanted to wrap up anything with CRDCN. But certainly I wanted to just take a chance to thank you both, Guy and Ross, for coming in to present today. Two very interesting talks, and we could all dive into deeper conversations, but perhaps we can follow up later with some of those. But very interesting, and thank you for coming, and thank you for publishing these papers with CPP. I personally like having them there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you,
Yeah,
everyone, for coming. Thank
thank you
you,
very much.
Tammy and Guy and Ross. This recording will be posted on our YouTube, and it'll be emailed out to all of the registrants. So if there's anything you want to see again, you'll be able to do so.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.